Yes. So, quick video reviewing the forces of evolution. So, these are the things that make evolution happen. So, first and foremost, we have natural selection, probably the predominant driving force of evolution. It's the one that we think of first when we think about the process of evolution. And so natural selection is when one phenotypic variation within the population provides a survival advantage over the other phenotypes within that population. Very important that it's phenotypic, not genotypic, because the environment cannot interact with genotypes. It has to interact with phenotypes, because that's the actual presentation of the trait. Right? And so this is driven by specific environmental pressures, and those environmental pressures will favor one phenotype over another. For instance, if the organism is a grasshopper that lives in green grass, if I have green grasshoppers and magenta grasshoppers, the green grasshoppers will blend into the grass, and the environmental pressure that is birds trying to hunt these grasshoppers will have a harder time seeing the green than the magenta. So we will see a shift in phenotypic predominance towards that green version of the grasshopper. Right? In turn, that will shift our allele frequency towards the green allele. Okay? Natural selection. The next is sexual selection. Very similar idea. I have one phenotype providing an advantage over the others. However, in this case, it is not a survival advantage, but a reproductive advantage. Right? So one phenotype will give that organism a better chance of making babies than the other phenotypes do. And so there are two types of sexual selection. There's intersexual, which is between the two sexes, where perhaps the female chooses the male mate based on a specific phenotypic trait. A traditional example of this is peacocks. Right? So you have that peacock with the big glorious tail, which is not a good thing to have in nature. It reduces your chance of surviving. However, the female peacocks, which are called peahens, are attracted to the qualities of those big glorious tails. Right? So the males with those big tails get to make more babies than the males without those big tails. They have a reproductive advantage. Okay. More often than not, it is the female that will choose the male in the mating, in the courtship. Occasionally, in the rare circumstance, it can go the other way. Okay. It's not a dead set rule that it has to be the female choosing the male, but it almost always is. Reproductive strategy stuff. Okay. The other version is intrasexual, okay, and that's competition within the sex. A good traditional example of this is two deers. You got two male deers fighting or competing for the right to mate with the females. And so the deers will come on together in this ceremonial fight where they'll size up each other's antlers. They'll look at the antlers, and the deer with the smaller antlers will leave, and the deer with the bigger antlers will stay and get to mate. The females didn't have anything to do with this choice, but there's a clear advantage to having the big antlers. You get to make more babies if you have big antlers. Okay. Both natural selection and sexual selection are talking about overall fitness, which is pretty much a measure of how many babies you're going to make. Right? The winner of evolution in the terms of selection is whoever makes the most babies. They pass on the most copies of that gene. Okay? And that's what we measure as fitness. Okay? So when we say survival of the fittest, we're basically saying who's going to make the most babies based on environmental conditions and sexual selection conditions. Yeah. Then we have gene flow, which is quite simply migration. So I got a population over here of space ducks. I got a population over here of space ducks. They have different allele frequencies. If this population enters this population and hangs out with them, that just changed the allele frequencies of both populations. Right? instant evolution, gene flow. And now they might mate, exchange some genes and then leave again, right? That changes the allele frequencies too. They don't have to stay together. But as long as they interact long enough to exchange genetic information, gene flow is happening. And then we got genetic drift. And so genetic drift is when random events are able to change the allele frequency of a population. And now, technically, more often than not, genetic drift is referring to statistical anomalies during the mating process, right? And so when you do meiosis and you do fertilization, right, it should be a 50-50 distribution of diploid chromosomes. However, sometimes by random chance, that distribution is not 50-50. Right? Sometimes it shifts one way or the other, just because it's just randomness. Let's go with that. It's easier for me to say. Right? So, for instance, if I were to flip a coin 100 times, I should get somewhere around 50-50 heads, tails. Right? However, it's not inconceivable that I might flip 75-25. Right? I could possibly, potentially even flip 100-0. Right? And so if this coin flip represents making babies, right, we're talking about shifting our alleles one way or the other just by accident. Nothing caused it. It wasn't natural selection. It was a random shift in allele frequency. This can also refer to random events that somehow change the allele frequency. Right? So like if a tornado comes along and kills half the population, and half of that population just so happened to be one of the alleles and not the other, that would shift the allele frequency as well. Right? And they didn't die because they had that allele. They just died and they had that allele. Random. The thing about genetic drift that you have to keep in mind is that only small populations are subject to this problem. Because if you have a lot of organisms, right, those little random events aren't going to have a big impact on the overall allele frequency. Right? It might shift it a little bit, but it's going to come back next generation. Right? So small populations are subject to genetic drift. And the last one is mutations. Right? And so the big thing about mutations is that it can instantaneously add a new allele to the population. Right? And so that is instantly a shift in allele frequency. Right? So yeah, that's it. Those are the 5 driving forces of evolution. You're welcome. Goodbye.